All right, well, I think we're ready to start. So today we're going to talk about interactive prototyping with DHTML. We'll focus there. You know, I have a real passion, like Bill Buxton talked about yesterday morning, around ideation. And DHTML is not always the best form to do a lot of your early ideation. But you'll find yourself in lots of situations where you've already got a website, you've already got pages, and you want to kind of iterate that. Or you want to get something as real, as close to real as possible. So that's where the DHTML prototyping really comes in handy. So I just want to state that because I really am a real big believer in sketching and early prototyping as rapidly as possible. But sometimes I've actually seen the DHTML prototyping be used that way, and we've done that at Netflix. So just a little bit about me. I've got a book that just came out, O'Reilly, you have to plug it right, on designing web interfaces. I did the pattern library back at Yahoo, so I'm a kind of a curator of patterns and techniques for design, and a game a long time ago. So the challenge around prototyping, any kind of prototyping in our world today is the interaction is really nuanced. You know, we got things like Flickr, you know, just the whole thing of being able to click on a title and edit it. Here's an example of something I did when I was at Yahoo called the Yahoo Gobbler for a product we had called Yahoo for Teachers. And basically what you're doing is grabbing things off the web page, and all the interesting moments as you move things from the page into the little panel that gobbles that up and gives it to the teacher as a project. Each one of those little stages is a moment in time where you can interact with the user. And being able to communicate that in a wireframe is difficult. So the way we did that was through a lot of prototyping to get it right. This is an example from Backpack with contextual tools. You hover, you get some kind of a click link. An example from the Gap of inline assistance. As you're doing things, things are changing and responding. Again, interaction is nuanced, so the typical wireframing mechanism is difficult to show that. You can show some of these things because sometimes they get to be frame by frame. But as Bill talked about yesterday morning, a lot has to do with the timing that's in between. Again, the inline assistant, page scrolling, it's Microsoft Live when you search for images. Just what the whole interaction with the scroll bar is going to be, as you go down. Getting that feel is something you can't communicate through wireframes, but you have to actually prototype it. And you actually have to sometimes get it into a real system, getting real data, so you know what kind of performance you're going to get back. And that's where this kind of prototyping really comes in handy. This is an older example from Broadmoor Hotels, a one-page checkout. But as you're doing things, the different panels are all responding to what you're selecting as you go through the checkout process for a hotel. Again, these things are nuanced and require a lot more detail. Here's an example from Yahoo. When I took the Yahoo Teachers product, they had the capability to hover over an image and get some tools to come up. The problem is when you came over the tools that cover the next image up. And this is something that when the designer designed it, they didn't catch the fact that they have this kind of anti-pattern called hover and cover, which as you move from one element to the next, you end up covering the other element. And so you affect navigation, you cause the person to do this zigzag kind of navigation effect. Now, once you're kind of familiar with this problem of hover and cover, you can almost spot it without prototyping. But prototyping lets you catch a lot of these things like this. And then we resolved it by just providing more space around it and making it so there's more of a muscle memory involved. And so you get more of a flow across instead of this back and forth. But again, prototyping was the key to finding that. This one from Yahoo Photos, now defunct. As you drag something into an album, you end up getting these in-between idiot boxes, right? These pop-ups. And that's something that once you actually put it in front of a user, you immediately see that this is ridiculous. You should be providing more subtle feedback with the album, lighting up, showing a number change to show something dropped in the photo. You could probably do without the dancing hamsters in between too, maybe. And then things like this were at Yahoo Local early on, got infatuated with the whole transition effects. Once you see that, the timing of that is ridiculous. And it's also a huge mousetrap. Once the thing grows out, to get outside, you got to go back and come back in. So all these things, around timing are things that we try to solve when we're doing interactive prototyping. And we can actually make things seem faster. We can slow down interactions so people understand what happened. We can reveal state change, as we do here when we delete something. It fades out, does kind of this self-healing delete. We can show relationships between objects, that this thing came from this other object through a zoom box, for example. And we can focus attention as soon as something changes. We can throw something up and fade it out, throw something else up and fade it out. These are a lot of different techniques like this, and just setting the stage for why this is important. I'll skip through this. This is basically just drag and drop, and we end up at Yahoo when I was working with my Yahoo team, going from a real slow kind of transition effect to really almost instantaneous. So prototyping with DHTML. The benefits, it lets you really start simple, and you can just take an existing page you already have. It gives you a higher fidelity look at it because you're going to be working with the technology that the site's actually in. This is, of course, assuming you're doing it in DHTML. And you're real close to that final solution, and then you have a living example that you can pass around, point a URL to, and that's a big advantage. But I want to really point out there's some problems with it. And technical savvy is one of the big ones. HTML is seductively simple, but as soon as you add in doing correct web standards, doing things so that it's flexible to change later, using CSS, it gets to be a lot more nuanced and difficult because of the way the browsers all operate and the cross-browser issues especially. Of course, you can take the approach where you pick one browser and go with it for prototyping, but if you have a desire down the road to make sure that's going to work across browsers, it's a lot better to start with the correct base. And the other really big thing that happens is when engineers start doing prototyping in HTML, it's too easy to kind of futz with stuff and just keep messing with it and keep messing with it. That's where the ideation stuff that Bill talked about yesterday really comes in handy because it's much more rough and you're playing with it. And if it's not rapid enough, it gets in the way of ideation. At Netflix, we did an example, just a prototyping exercise about, well, I guess it was maybe a month ago. And basically what we had was on the site, for each movie, there's 3 different buttons. There's an add button to add to the DVD queue. There's a play button for playing it, as you saw yesterday at the keynote. And then there's another one that's add to instant queue. And they show up on hover, the 3 buttons. There's 2 that show up initially, and then on hover, the 3rd one. Not really happy with that. So we started experimenting with designing different ideas. And we came up with, I don't know, probably 10 major variations on it. And each of those had different timing concerns. Each of those had different, activation points. And so what we ended up doing was one of my engineers on my team, in 1 week, built about 100 variations, maybe 150 variations to this. You can see this long list as a link to every one of the variations in DHTML, and then each of those represent all the different pages. She was able to do that because just using HTML and jQuery. jQuery was a big part of that because jQuery is very, very quick to add behaviors and change the page rapidly. That was really successful because what happened was we had the UI engineer on my team, myself, the product manager, and a couple of design leads working on this problem initially. Kim would go off and do the rapid prototyping, and the next day come back with maybe 20, 30, or 40 different variations. We would look at them and go, okay, well, these look good, these are kind of weird. She would come up with her own ideas too, which was great for her because she's got a good design skill too. And she had some variations that we hadn't thought of, and which was fed back in the loop. And we did that through the course of the week. And so we started on a Monday, and by the next Monday we had it in qualitative research in front of users, 6 different choices, and we got feedback on the 6 choices. The 2 winners, I always love when this happens, where the 2 that I picked would be the winner. It makes your ego feel really good. Most of the time it doesn't work that way, right? Because users will surprise you. But we took those and we made more variations and more prototyping and put that through usability research. And now we'll be launching that on the site. And the way we do it at Netflix is we do a lot of quantitative testing. We put it out and do A/B testing, and we'll see what the real winner is as it gets live on the site. We're pretty confident the ones that we're fielding all have a good user experience. The key is which ones will drive the most Q ads, which is a real health indicator for our site. Which ones will drive the most engagement, those kind of things we measure very carefully. In fact, we even have 2 full-time statisticians in our product management staff that crunch and analyze the data and create the charts and the graphs and the visualizations and the data for us to get feedback. But you can see it went from just rapid prototyping to the site within a few weeks. So the big thing when you're actually developing software anyway, and I think I'm going to preach this from a prototyping perspective, is go ahead and do separation of concerns. You want to separate, out the structure of the page itself, the content, from the style and, from the logic, the behavior. And generally we think about that as, JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. In the world of DHTML, it kind of leaks over a little bit because sometimes you're putting some behaviors over in CSS. I'm not talking about expressions. I'm talking about in CSS sometimes you'll put the mouse behaviors, hover, especially as we've moved along into standards mode and we've got the browsers moving forward. You can actually support hover expressions other than just anchor on any other element. That is if you're in strict mode on IE7. On IE6 doesn't work. And there are actually performance issues, by the way, around that on IE7. So, keeping the structure, style, and logic separate. So I really think this is really important because rapid is not just the initial rapid. It's as you go forward and move forward. It's very important. So here's the structure for the talk, okay? We're going to talk about the three challenges: layout, behavior, and the data, okay? So this is not going to be, you're not going to have every question answered. I'd be glad to answer questions at the end and try to answer even more questions. But I want to give you a framework for thinking about how to prototype with HTML. I want to show you a lot of tools and some things you can use to help in each of these areas. Because these really are the challenges. Trying to lay something out, if you do a 3-column, you want liquid layout, a fluid layout, or you've got a more complex kind of layout. Those things can eat up a lot of time. And then the behavior, actually, injecting behaviors into the page, in essence, kind of like sprinkling the page, and then being able to fake or attach to real data quickly. So we'll talk about layout first. It's really just about putting everything wherever it should be as quickly as possible. And I've got an asterisk with minimal hacking. So, it's not easy because there's like at least 14 IE6 layout bugs. There's 9 different ways, 9 basic ways if you look out on the web for laying out columns. There's 3 different rendering engines, 8 major browsers. There's 5 ways within DHTML to kind of lay things out or specify layout. There's like at least 6+ ways to vertically align something, and vertical alignment actually turns out to be a lot harder than it should be, especially with block elements. And here's an example, of just doing a column layout. So on the one on the left with the text, this is just a simple 2-column form, and you can use this in your prototyping, but I'll try to show you a little bit better way in a minute, where I basically just set the margin left of the text, and I've got the other element there, and so it's going to end up aligning there. And then the top one, this is using floats plus margins. And so what I've done here is I've actually floated left the first column. I've set a margin left on the center column. I've set a margin right on that same second column, and then I've got a float right on the other column. And of course, widths have to be carefully respected. That's one way to do multiple column layout. Another one is using all floats. Float the first 2 left, float the last one right. Again, you got to watch out for the width because you can get the wrapping effect. And there are IE6 layout bugs around that too, so you have to be careful if you're doing percentage-based layout, because sometimes in different situations IE6 will not have the what's called has layout, will not have the layout flag tripped internally to do things correctly. And then here's one that's nested, where you actually take the first 2 columns and you put a div or a container around that, and you float that container left, you float the 2 columns that are inside of it left and right, and then you float the last thing right. Now, I'm pointing this out because I just want to emphasize that what looks simple and what should be simple is actually kind of painful, to lay stuff out in the HTML world. Now, you can certainly go find many sites that explain these techniques, and there's a couple of books. I have about 6 or 8 slides, maybe 9 slides at the end that are just resources for you. There are lots of recommendations, and I have a couple of books mentioned in there that are really good that will get you really up to speed on these techniques. And then you got the box model problem, the IE6, quirks the way it works. Counting how the width is different from the standards mode. That has to be accounted for when you're trying to lay things out. And then, floats, just even understanding the concept of floats, which is what you use in most DHTML layout to do anything dynamic. The flow of the page of block elements, there's block and inline elements in the world of CSS. Block being that it's basically a block of something that the rendering engine wants to lay out vertically. And then the inline elements like paragraphs and such like that, I mean like spans and such, it wants to lay those out on an inline perspective. And then, so when you want to flow something around it, you end up floating left, this, say, image, for example, then having the text just below it, and it ends up floating it around it like that. So again, what you're doing is you're always trying to lay out a page against the flow, right? The rendering engine wants to lay out text and images. That's really what it was built for. It's built for documents. So that as soon as you come to terms with that and understand that, you'll understand concepts like collapsing margins, you know, where you have something that has a bottom margin, something has a top margin, and they'll actually collapse because it's really biased towards laying out text and images, and you're trying to do a GUI layout in that world. So coming to terms with that really early and knowing that you're laying out against the flow is a real trick to understanding how to do good layout in DHTML. And then, you know, you have like this situation where I've floated left 3 elements, and there's not enough room, so one wraps down, you know, that kind of situation. But the flow is going left to right because I'm floating. And then you have the concept of clearing floats that comes into play, where I've got the floats going. Now I want to stop that flowing that's going this way, and I want to break it, and now go back to the normal flowing down. Those are all techniques. So floats are not, you know, terribly hard, but they're really, when you're first getting started, or you're not doing it all the time, they can really slow down your prototyping, you know, because you run into some bugs and issues. But once you get a hold of them, they're not bad. But another technique that's actually really useful in prototyping is absolute positioning. And when you say absolute positioning, this doesn't mean you're really fixing it to a certain part of the page. There's some bad naming in the CSS world. Absolute is really relative to the ancestor that's been positioned. So I'll give you some examples. In this case here, I've got A. The dotted line is the actual document. And then inside that is A, which is just a div container. And I've got it set 5 ems left and right, from the left and right side. And so now A has actually been positioned. So it now has its own positioning. And so now if B's contained in A, what happens is if I position it absolutely, 5em on the right and 5em on the bottom, it's actually positioned relative to A, not to the document, okay? Which can be really handy because then you can create kind of basically a positioning area and do everything relative to that. You can also just say that A is position relative in CSS. And that makes the page, that div container actually be a positioning element. And so anything inside of it, when you position it, absolutely is going to position relative to that. And then here's an example where I didn't specify positioning. Notice that B is no longer positioned inside A, right, because it's down below. Now, again, these are a lot of details, and I don't expect you to walk out of here and really, if you don't have experience, understand this completely. But I'm hoping that if you try to do this stuff, this gives you kind of a good leap into it. But I think there's some better ways. I mean, choosing positioning over floats is a good way. Picking a grid layout system is the best way to go about laying out pages. And what I mean by that is here's a page, and if you lay a grid on it, everything's laid out according to a grid. I think this is a 16-column grid. So there's actually each column has so many pixels, and there's a bit of margin each one. And you begin to lay the page out like that, and this is, you know, from a design perspective, is the right way to lay pages out. And then if you can tie that into your prototyping framework and your real framework that, you know, for your site, then from the specification all the way through is going to be much more rapid. And you're not into just all those little small things. And one of the best ways to do this is just use a CSS framework. A lot of the stuff that I just showed you, most of the time you don't have to deal with if you use a CSS framework. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a minute. But the beauty of these is that, you know, you're building on the work of others. They've already tested across all the browsers. They simplified the process of laying out grid-based layout. And it, of course, normalizes all the browsers. One of the things that most of them contain is something called a CSS reset that Eric Meyer talked about years ago, and YUI has that in their Grid Manager, Blueprint, and others have it. And basically the idea is that, you know, each browser has a secret style sheet on their particular operating system that they use, that they set the fonts and spacing and things like that, that you don't see. So what it does, it just takes all those and sets them back to some, kind of nulled out standard. And then you end up building on top of that. Your style sheet now is the gospel for all the different browsers. And that's a real key to doing good, quick layout, because you kind of get rid of that. Operate in strict mode, get CSS reset in there, and then use the CSS framework. We'll take it. One objection we'll get into a little bit is the non-semantic nature of these kind of layout expressions. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute, and talk about both sides of that. There's the very purist crowd, which I kind of am part of a little bit, but I'm much more pragmatic, I think. Has a big objection to this, and I'll explain that controversy. So here's at least 12 different CSS frameworks. The last one is not really mine, okay? It's actually called my, not really mine, CSS framework. That's not mine, okay? So I'll quickly just point out YUI when I was at Yahoo. So I'm very familiar with that one. In fact, we've been using that live on our site at Netflix, and that's helped a lot. Although we're seriously considering, we've been prototyping a little bit with Blueprint CSS, and we think we'll probably move the site towards Blueprint. So I'm going to focus my time talking about it because I think it has the most rapid nature around prototyping needs. And I'll show examples. So here's a page just laid out with the Blueprint CSS framework. And I'm going to show you, I'm laying the grid out. They use a 24-column grid. It's a 950 width page. In a minute, I'll show you that you can actually set it to any width you want or any kind of grid columns you want. There's tools to do that real easily. So you can see that things respect those boundaries. 24 columns is a lot, but it gives you a lot of flexibility, right? So you just pick the column you want to lay something out in, and it just shows up in that column. You can tell it, whether it's going to have spacing on the right and those sort of things. So let's look at this just one area here at the top of the page. And then let's kind of zoom in on that. And I've got Firebug showing. And if you don't use Firebug, that's a really good tool to help in prototyping. I've got the one of the div classes. You see it's blue up there, the light blue? Corresponding to the bottom panel, div class. See the class? It says span-7 and call border. Okay, by saying span 7, it's saying it's spanning 7 columns. Okay? And then the call border says take one more column for the border, so it takes up eight columns, right? That's pretty simple. I basically have specified that this is going to take up 7 columns. It's going to have a border that's that dark purple, and the yellow is from the other one. And so, you can specify a layout really quickly with this mechanism. Span 7 means, span 7 grid columns, and the column border there is add the one more. They've got nice cheat sheets. So, for example, if you look, you can see in the top left, there's the span 1 all the way to span 24. And then there's like, at the bottom, there's other prepins, where you can prepin something before. And the cheat sheet, you can pretty much read the cheat sheet and look at a few examples and kind of get going. They also have tools that I'll show you that really make this rapid. There's a Blueprint Grid CSS generator. And what you can do with it is you can tell it how many columns you want, what the column widths are, the margin widths, and it'll generate the CSS for you. It'll also generate a grid PNG file, an image file. And what this image file does, it's that background I've been showing you when I show the pages, and then I show the grid. And there's actually a class you set on your main body, and it'll turn it on. And you can there's even some bookmarklets you can get that just flip it on and off. So from a debugging perspective, you can do it really, really fast. So a really nice set of tools, EcoSpace out there. Somebody built this thing called Plum. And with Plum, what you do is you just drag out what you want your layout to look like. And I'll let this kind of run for a second. It's a good point here to stop and ask if there's any questions up this point while that runs. Yes? No, not table layouts. This is actually building full CSS layouts, web standard, non-table-based layouts. Yes, I am dead set against table layouts. Yeah. CSS3, we're going to have table layouts again, right? But they're using the normal elements. You just express, table kind of feel towards it. Table, I should qualify that tables are really good. The question was whether it's table layout or a CSS-based layout. So you see let me stop here real quick. What it did was it generated the code for that. It gave me what it thought I meant, and then it generated the code for it. And you can see it's just a simple div outline structure. with those right CSS classes to be able to lay that out. But tables are actually good for data. Like our queue page, if you're familiar with Netflix, we have all of your DVDs listed or the instant movies listed. That's done with a table. And we've experimented with lists, but tables actually work better. And it's data. So data is the right thing to lay out. It's a lot easier to line your columns and do other stuff like that with it. But for normal just page layout, tables are much more heavy in the sense of what you have to lay out. And browsers have gotten better about rendering those, especially when you're nesting, but it's really hard to change those. Whereas with the div layout, I can just change the actual CSS styles and get a different layout totally. In fact, we just did a Netflix page on self-service where we have a dashboard kind of help system. And we have a directory, exact same HTML, just switches to CSS, not a bit of code changes at all, totally radically different layout. You couldn't get that with a table-based layout. And then YUI, they have their CSS grid also, and they have a YUI grid builder. A good friend of mine actually built this. And it's really nice. I've used it a lot to just quickly generate a page. And it generates the CSS. And I mean, the HTML, the CSS is already generated. So I think we'll see the HTML come up here in a second. I think I have that in here. Hopefully I do. Show the code. So you can see in their example, they've got like YUI-GD and YUI-T1 and those sort of things. Now this is what, from a semantic nature, you'd like to have your structure and your content be free of really any expression of layout. So in a sense, the layout expression is kind of leaking into the HTML, right? It's kind of subtle. You're doing it with class names. But you are putting it in the markup. So there are actually tools that are out there, and I've got it in the resources section. One is a PHP-based one that you specify the grids. For example, in Blueprint, you say something spans 7 or whatever. Well, it generates the necessary style blocks that will map that into, so you can take something like header, footer, content, nav, and map those into those same classes, and it'll generate the class specification that matches what Blueprint has for that, so you can make it totally semantic. You can also take these ideas and kind of just morph them for yourself and make it so that they're semantic in nature. The difference is, using something like header, footer, nav, content, you're not saying what the style is, you're not saying what the layout is, and that's very, just it's clean and clear. Whereas this other does this. But when we talk about rapid prototyping, I'm a little less fussy about that. I can deal with this, and even a lot of times what I'm doing, on the Netflix site, we use Java and JSP to generate the page. We do a lot of JavaScript too. But so I end up writing JSP tags that hide a lot of this, and so from a semantic perspective, my JSP is very semantic, right? So I tend to be a little less worried about it because I'm a little more pragmatic, but there are solutions to fix it. And some of you in the audience may disagree with me violently, and that's okay. I mean, I could be wrong, and I'll probably change my mind again. I do it many times. And they have a nice grid cheat sheet. A lot of the Blueprint, a lot of the CSS frameworks have these. And you can see the YUI-G, YUI first. Although I find that the Blueprint ones make more sense than these do. I mean, I say that even though I was kind of loosely part of the YUI team at one point. But I'm always trying to look for where I'm at, what works best for me. That's why I actually picked jQuery at Netflix, because it worked better than the YUI library, even though I love the YUI library. But you got to match it to where you're at and what your needs are. There's another one that's come out last year, early last year, I think it was, 960GS. It's 960.gs. Again, these are all in the resources section of the presentation. And again, they base theirs on a 960 grid instead of a 950. However, Blueprint, of course, you can do a 960 grid if you want. And there are reasons to pick a 960 grid over a 950. And this is one of the reasons it's divisible by so many different things. Okay, it just really works well. And it's just super flexible. So you might consider when you're picking the size of your site, 960 is a good. We're actually at 950, and I think we're going to change to 960 because of just after doing more research, it seems like that makes more sense. Small knit, but there's this 960GS Fluid, which there's both a MooTools version and a jQuery version, and these are pretty nice because what they've done is They support the fluid layout, so you see when I resized it, it's all fluid. And the move tools in the jQuery aren't needed for the fluid part of it, but there's an interactive perspective to it. I'll talk about it when I get to the interactive section. I'll bring this back up and talk about it. But they have a fluid-based system, so that's really nice and handy. You don't have to do any really extra work to make that work across the browsers. And then, so this gets into that whole semantic and non-semantic. And I've got a list. There's a thing called boilerplate and the blueprints compressed.rb. You can substitute semantic names during that process. There's something called semantify, and there's the CSS mix-in that I talked about for PHP. So those are all things. And in some sense, it's a non-issue for prototyping, although, you know, if you really have to take the prototyping code and immediately turn it to production code, then it is an issue. You know, and the style techniques we talked about, just a few things. You know, use an appropriate markup. You know, paragraph's a paragraph. Don't go crazy with divs. You don't need divs around everything. You don't really have to. In some of those examples, you see a lot of divs generated in the blueprint. You don't really have to do that. You can attach those styles to whatever the elements are there. If you had, you know, something that wasn't, say it was a paragraph, you could associate it to that rather than a div. So you don't have to go div crazy. That's something that people kind of start doing when they try to be semantic. They go div nuts. You don't need to do that. Don't do unnecessarily nesting if you don't have to for layout, because that makes you brittle. You know, just using pixels for font sizes. There's a lot of religious wars about whether to use ems or percentage. Or the YUI team, they use the percentage based. We started going that way on Netflix, and the problem is when you start nesting fonts, you know, you got one that's a percentage here. Now that's a percentage of that. You know, it's based on the percentage of that one. So it gets to be kind of hairy, and we've gone back to pixels. So it seems to work better for us. And Blueprint, no, actually 960GS does pixel-based, and yes. Yeah, changing the font size is a big issue around doing the others, although as we go forward, the browsers are handling that better and better. And we already have, on the Netflix site, we're kind of broken in that way because of the way the box shots work and because of the way the buttons work. So I'm cheating a little bit on that, just giving you real-world pragmatic, you know. But yeah, that is a real concern. That's why you go with ems and percentage, you know, for the resizing. But as we're seeing the new browsers, they're handling the zoom differently than they have in the past. Generally, you know, I try to test for one size up and one size down, and say that's, if I can handle that pretty well, I'm happy. And 2 sizes up is getting to where you know, is it worth my engineering effort to do that? You know, and we're going to try to solve that more and more over the year and do that through our libraries so that that becomes a little more automatic. But, you know. So let's talk about behavior. This is about making the page come alive as quickly as possible. So we've got the page laid out. You know, we can use one of the frameworks to get something rapidly put together, have something showing. Now we need to really put something together. When you think about an interaction, it's really based, you got the page element, you got the event handler, and you got the behavior, and those 3 things have to work together. So, you know, I'm representing them here as these blocks. You know, there's a lot of interaction that happens between the user. You know, event gets fired on the page element. You know, fires an event handler, performs some behavior, it modifies the element. That's kind of the cycle you go through. And then the user can view that, see the response. And that's sort of the goodness cycle that happens in behavior. So if you sort of think about it like this, you begin to think more in chunks of behavior. Again, it's about separation of concerns. And you'll start thinking in much more reusable aspects. And fortunately, a lot of the libraries now are going that way. Like jQuery is a good example of that, where things are kind of behavior plugins, you know, behavior-based. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. So keeping the interaction objects and behavior separate, you know, and this is really all about behavior injection. So I've got some markup, and now I want to wake the page up. A lot like you saw yesterday morning with the blend expression tools, where they just were taking an image and adding behaviors to that and waking it up. It's the same kind of concept, you know, with HTML here. So, you know, you want to avoid things like, you know, onClick equals some action. You want to use the actual, you know, W3C event attachment mechanisms. All the libraries support the right way to do that, because again, that's sprinkling in behavior into your markup, and you want to have that separated out into your JavaScript. and then associating actions with the match elements. And we'll show you what that means. So here, what I've done is I've got a bunch of panels, and they're hidden, and I'm showing, I'm going to show one. So what happens is I've set in my CSS, I set anything that has no errors, or forgotten to be a display none. So it's just not showing. But in my jQuery, and this is an example of jQuery code here, injecting some behavior, I'm saying find any class with errors. You see the one I've got pointing to is that one, and do a .show. .show is going to set the display, to block and do the right thing into the covers, or if it needs to set the visibility, it'll do that too. So I'm turning off the panels when I generate the page, and then I'm showing based on here on errors. Now I would attach this to an event handler in the real world, but I'm just showing you real quickly how behavior gets added, say in jQuery. jQuery is all about finding DOM elements and then invoking some action or on that behavior on that. Going back to that 960GS example, we'll return to jQuery in a minute and go in more detail. So this is a 960GS fluid. This one's using jQuery. There's a MooTools one, which was the original one. Another guy kind of morphed it to use jQuery. And so it's the same fluid layout you saw, but all these different behaviors you're seeing, like in the responding, the collapsing, the expanding, the menu drop-downs and all that, they're just nothing but lists and div blocks and such like that with the right class names associated with them. And the class names all have behavior associated with those class names, something like what I showed you there earlier. So if you just take the 960GS, you've got the layout and you've got the behavior injection for some very basic elements already there. And what happens is, for example, this menu system, you can see here's the HTML for it. I've got a class I set to nav and main, and those two styles come together to make a main menu where it has the drop-down capability. And you can see that I've got a list of submenu 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 under a main menu 1, and then there's menu 2, and it would keep going. I just clicked it off to keep it short. So it's a pretty long list of all those submenus. And just by setting the class nav and main with this CSS included and their JavaScript included, then you get that behavior. So it's pretty rapid to create a menu. Now you can go more of a component-based approach. A lot of libraries have like EXT.js or YUI or any number of ones in jQuery, et cetera, have some different components. This sort of goes with the thought of like, if you've read the book Transcending CSS, which really kind of proposes the content out approach instead of the kind of the controller component approach in. So you just have the markup and then you wake the markup up, make it behave a certain way. And so I tend to like it because, I could completely radically change the way it looks. I'm not embedding in control. I'm just taking the content and giving it, behavior. Some of the controls, that's what they do. But some of the frameworks will take the approach where the markup is generated by the JavaScript, and some take the markup and actually do something with it. And that's kind of the difference between the two. And I think the one where you take the content and wake it up is the most flexible, from a prototyping and a production perspective. So the menu behavior is tied to those two classes. So this one, when I close it, it toggles the whole box. There's an accordion inside of it, but the actual word that says accordion, that's a box, and it's going to collapse the box. And I just have a dot box. I set the class to that div to be a dot box, and automatically it gets that closing behavior, right? And then this is another kind of menu that's on the side that's expanded already, but behaves, with the hover and what's been activated, and what your when you hover over an activated item versus a non-activated item, all those sort of things. That's just dot menu. So you can see that if you include this 960GS, say with MooTools or jQuery, those two versions, you automatically get the fluid layout, and you get some behavior injection. Now, you may want to extend that and add some more things yourself, or you may want to tweak those, do something differently. But it gives you a really good leg up start. I did a kind of experimental thing it's been about 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, because I've always felt like DHTML prototyping is just too hard, and it was even harder a year and a half ago. So I did this thing called Protoscript. You can find it at protoscript.com. I spent probably 9 days total on it, but it's got a full wiki. It's got all the behaviors. It's got 30 examples. I kind of went crazy over those 9 days. but it was something I've been wanting to get together for a while. But I'll show it to you just briefly, not to recommend that you necessarily use it. I haven't updated in a while. It still works, but I don't know how much I'm going to actually support it at this point, because it just highlights the power of the behavior injection method. So, here's an example from my homepage where what I've done is I've said, I've got an image, and its ID is avatar. That's my old avatar at Yahoo. And I'm going to set it on click. You're going to fade. And when you fade it, close it. Okay, so what I ended up using in this wacky world of ProtoScript was JSON. So if you're familiar with the JSON data structures, Doug Crockford, who's the guy who kind of discovered it, was my cube mate, so that probably influenced me at Yahoo. But the idea was have as much a declarative mechanism as possible to describe the interaction, so you could build a GUI on top of it, which, as you can see, I've never got around to building an actual GUI tool. I was going to embed something in Firebug. I still have visions to do that, but hopefully the world of tools will catch up and I don't have to do it. It's more to scratch my own itch. But so let me show you some more examples. Here is just collapsing. Here's another with drag and drop, and these are all expressed with that ProtoScript language. I'll show you an example here. When I click this, it does the self-healing delete. Okay, so how does that work? So what happens is you can see this is the actual ProtoScript code to do that. So I'm saying find me all the spans that contain an X. Right? That's using jQuery's under the covers. I actually could support a number of different frameworks. Their selector syntax, and so the contains X. So it's going to find. What's going to happen is it's going to find those guys, right? So it finds 4 elements, and now it's going to apply behavior to those 4 elements. So the context is those 4 elements. Set the style to be a cursor pointer. Do a for a click behavior. If you click on it, the onClick handler is going to do a fade, and it's going to target the. And I'll show you this as I do my arrows here. It's going to target the whole LI structure. So even though I set the context of these guys, it's going to target the whole thing. I've just changed what I'm targeting. If I hadn't put the target, it would have faded just the element I clicked on, right? So I've expanded the context of it and said, now, in the fade, target all the LIs that have multiple. And you can see, did I not? Yeah, okay. At the very top, there's a div ID multiple. So when you say pound multiple, you're saying find something that's got multiple. Find all the LIs inside of it. Again, this is jQuery. This is CSS3 selector syntax is what this is. And then set the opacity to go down to 0. And when you complete, close it. So it's a real terse kind of language to express interaction behavior, right? And so then what happens is, it's gonna fade it out. So when you get the click, it's gonna do that. And target the multiples and do the close, that sort of thing. So I defined these behaviors, and this is kind of a good list to kind of think about when you're prototyping. I needed animate, color animate, fade, spotlight, drag and drop. Switching classes is a big technique, for doing things. You set the student styles in classes. Just switch the class dynamically on an event, and you get a completely different look. Toggling things open and close. Fetching some HTML through AJAX and setting some HTML. That's just really inner HTML. Those are all the basic kind of things you do a lot of. So there's some thinking in that might help you in prototyping. Looking at it. Here's a demo with just drag and drop. And this is interesting because the people can only be dragged to the people drop, and the non-people things can be dragged to the things category. So you see that's got that kind of behavior, and you can actually see that on the site. There's all the code and stuff there to get an example of it. And then there are just some real basic events that usually get used all the time. And then there's a lot of callbacks, mouse down and mouse up on replace class, all these kind of things. So again, some ideas. So, I moved on to use jQuery a lot, and I'm going to kind of show you color-coded here to try to help you understand jQuery in like one sheet, so you can use it for your prototyping. So on the right, I've got this structure. I've got a class module. I've got H2 header. I've got a div class body, BD, okay, with some content, and I've got a footer. So it's like a typical module on a page, like a news page or something. And then you see elements of behavior and events. I've got those color-coded, and I have the actual code color-coded. So when I'm saying $div, I'm finding all the divs on the page. and I'm saying now add a class called highlighted to it. Okay, and the one down below, I find the footer. So I'm finding the class footer, which is there's only one footer in this one, but I could have multiple modules on the page, and every footer would have the same behavior associated with it. Set a click, and then the function for that, or the callback for that, is to take the element, that this is really the element of that got activated during the event, and add a class called highlighted. And highlight would be a style that has some kind of, change to color or background color or whatever. So you can see you can target elements really quickly and easily, with this sort of approach, and add behaviors. And with jQuery, you can actually add your own plugins that become first-class citizens. So you could have your own .do something, right, that does your own whatever. And it's pretty easy to add those plugins. And there's a whole ecospace of plugins out there. These are a bunch of jQuery behaviors that are available in the core, but there's like over 1,000 plugins that are out there in the ecospace. So you can get lost in those pretty quickly. But there's a lot of good behavior to help you get going fast. And these are the normal jQuery events that you can use. And so, you can also do something like adding classes that represent behavior. And we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier. With the jQuery method, what we're doing, and with the ProtoScript method, what we're doing is you take just your normal, take your markup, and you find stuff in the page. Now, there's good and bad to that, because normally you don't want those selector syntax to be very complicated. One, it's harder to understand. Two is it becomes brittle to the page because you're actually specifying a certain hierarchy. You're saying, hey, it has to be in something that has this ID, and it's the third element of that or whatever. So you want to typically avoid that. So you add some semantic names to stuff, and then you attach those. So most of the time you use the class or an ID, and that's what you're usually attaching to. In this example here, what's happening is, this is from Kevin Hale has a couple of great articles on prototyping with Ajax that I'd really highly recommend. It's also in my resources section. And he discussed this one called the CSS Boolean approach. And what I've got is I've got a bright star and a dim star, and I've got the words on or off. And so the star can either be bright with the word on, or it can be dim with the word off beside it, right? And the word options in the middle of it, the actual text. So it gets a little complicated, but you can see what I've tried to do is highlight to show you that basically if the .ifTrue and .ifFalse classes are all set to not display, so that turns both sections off, really, all four of those elements around the word option. And then if anything has .true as a parent, and the actual element is .ifTrue, then I'm going to display it inline. I'm going to turn it on, in other words. And display none means hide it. Display inline means show it. And then I'm always setting the if true to be a color green and the if false color red. So just by changing, this, I can actually turn it on or off. That's the idea. I find this to be a little complicated to follow myself personally. So I tend to like the other one better, where I'm just taking some behavior and injecting. But it is an approach that I wanted to call out. Let's see. So I think that just shows what I just said. And then there's a class behaviors jQuery library that has a number of different things, like, here's two lists that are linked together. And all you really end up doing, you see what I've got highlighted there in the orange, linked selects. If you set the class to a select box or select component in HTML to have linked selects, then it'll connect it up. And the other one, I think you have to say, I think it has to be my linked select. I think that's what it is. I have to go back and look at that. Sorry about that. But the basic idea is you can tie these two selects together, and that would be normally a good bit of coding or whatever, but it's done for you by just setting classes. And then, of course, just the old style class switching, which I alluded to earlier. So instead of doing a bunch of JavaScript code where you get an event and you set a bunch of style stuff directly on an element, bundle all those styles up into a class in your CSS, and then just switch the class name. So if something's like highlighted versus non-highlighted might be the two class names, and the highlighted one has the background set to, say, red, and the other one has it set to transparent, or it doesn't always work with all browsers. Maybe it's set to white. anyway, you end up on the event switching the class name, and you get that effect, that behavior. And that's basically the concept of a class mix-in. I'm always surprised there's actually a number of developers who don't know that you can have multiple CSS classes. When you say class equals something, you can have multiple ones. Class name space, class name space, class name. So you can, with say jQuery, you got a method called add class. You can just add class. You got a method called toggle class. You can toggle it in and out. You got one remove class, so you can manipulate the class attribute for any element dynamically through JavaScript, which gives you a lot of capability to change styles and stuff real rapidly, with an event mechanism. Then there's you can actually do a lot of cool stuff just using GreaseMonkey and jQuery. There's an article, and again, it's in my resources section, on how to integrate GreaseMonkey and jQuery, but I actually have the code here with a few additions. So if you create a GreaseMonkey script and set it to whatever, with GreaseMonkey scripts, what you end up doing is, for those that don't know what GreaseMonkey is, you're able to write this JavaScript that's attached to any page. So you could say, like, it was set to netflix.com star, just anything at netflix.com. Whenever Firefox loads that page, and you've got the GreaseMonkey enabled for that page, it's going to run that code as soon as the page starts loading or gets loaded. And it allows you to then inject behaviors in the page. A lot of people use it, say, to get rid of ads, to change the layout of pages, or do something else kind of clever they wish the site did. But you can use it from a prototyping perspective. There's a lot of gobbledygook down below, the add jQuery to GreaseMonkey. That's just because you're kind of living in a different world in the GreaseMonkey Firefox extension. The actual window name is not window, it's unsafe window. You have to wait for the page to really be loaded to invoke jQuery. I'm fetching it dynamically through by creating a script on the fly that goes out and picks up the Google APIs. Google's hosted version of jQuery, so you don't have to worry about hosting it yourself and those kind of things. But you see where it says start prototype, the function, add your behaviors here with jQuery. That's where you put your prototype code. So you could take one of your existing pages that's already running live on the site, right? And you could just add the jQuery to it and start experimenting right there without doing anything else, right? And that's a really nice way to iterate on something, because you can really tweak a page. I use this all the time at Netflix because we have a bunch of internal apps that really suck. Like our version of Flixzilla, Bugzilla, we call Flixzilla, and it just is pretty horrendous. So I've morphed it into something that's more usable. I've taken a lot of our internal tools, and we have a great Tracer Central, but it didn't like the way it was laid out, and it was real complicated. Nobody in my team could figure out which parameters to hit. So for our team, they go to it, and it's all custom for the UI tools, for our round-trip query stuff. But you can use it for prototyping, and it's a pretty handy thing to do. So I put the jQuery code there. And then Firebug is great because you can edit HTML on the fly. You can edit the CSS on the fly. You can look and visualize what the layout is for everything, so you can figure out the problems. And you can also even manipulate JavaScript on the fly. There's actually a nice Firebug extension that's never publicized. It's called Coder. It's by Steve Souders, a friend of mine who did the High Performance Web Pages book. He's now over at Google as the performance chief over there, and it's nice because it's a Firebug extension. And what it allows you to do is you can find, if you search for Steve Souders Coder, you'll find it. And what it does you do is take any JavaScript on the page, and you can load it into a panel, an edit panel, and just change it on the fly and resubmit it, and it's updated on the page. So you can change the behaviors dynamically as you go. I find that to be pretty useful. It's also a real useful tool to debug Firefox extensions, because I've written Firebug extensions, which are Firefox extensions for Firebug. And it was a lifesaver for debugging and finding out what's going on. And then, you can use CSS to simulate mouse behaviors, like we talked about hover, especially in the newer browsers, in strict mode. These are things you need to kind of understand. You need to understand what a class is, what an ID is. Class is basically any number of elements on the page get a class name, and it can be applied to it. An ID is, there's only one of those on a page. So it's a unique thing that you're getting a hold of. And the style class switching, the inner HTML, which you can use in jQuery, set HTML, I think is what it's called, or it's HTML. And then using anchors as, 8 tags. Anchors is basic navigation action hooks. and then all these other things I mentioned before. So we'll wrap up here kind of quickly with the data and content. This is trying to approximate reality. You know, you got your layout, you got your behavior, and you want to be able to attach some data in, right? And one of the more really powerful things, like in jQuery, for example, is just a simple little .ajax. So it takes the complexity of doing the you know, XML HTTP request, the AJAX stuff, and just wraps it into something really simple. So, you know, all I'm doing here is saying, go fetch something on my server called test.html. And, you know, when it's successful, see it's got this function. And what I'm getting back, I'm calling HTML, just a variable HTML. And then what I'm doing is saying, hey, inside that, find something that's got a pound results, because I know that HTML has that. And my HTML that's going to contain this has it, I'm sorry. And then I'm going to append what I got back from the AJAX call into that page. So I have some module, for example, and that's called the pound results. Say it's search results, right? And I've got the ID of results on it. This code here would then go out and find test HTML and plug it into that container on the page. So you could attach that, you know, to an event, so that on some click you could have a, you know, $.click, find something you want to click on, AJAX, because you can chain jQuery together and you get this behavior in a one-liner, which is, you know, pretty nice. And then using public APIs, there's a lot of public APIs you can actually do some mock data from. I've done this a lot, you know, with Yahoo Search data or Google Search or Flickr Images or Google Maps, or I mean, there's a whole bunch of those out there. So being familiar with what you can do from those is really important. JSON, JavaScript object notation, which is just really part of JavaScript, is a way you can define in a string, in essence, a data structure. Two data structures, you know, basically your objects and arrays. So here what I've done is I've created an object, and that object, the curly braces signal that I'm creating an object, and the name field is set to Jack B. Nimble, and then at large is set to true, and grade is set to A, and level is set to 3. And I've done that in a very terse format, right? So you can define data real quickly, mock data, and then you can access it, you know, I'll show you in a minute, by saying .name or at large. In the case of .at large, you shouldn't put spaces in if you're going to use it in that mechanism. You'd have to use a bracket, so I probably shouldn't use that as an example. Bad example, forget what I said. Just pretend it said large. Too complicated. And then .grade and .level. Here's an array, Sunday, Monday through, you know, Saturday. And here's another array that's a 3x3 array. Again, using brackets this time instead of the square bracket, instead of the curly brace, difference between an array and an object. And you can nest them. You can have an object that then has arrays in it, that then has objects, and you can keep going. And all those things are then accessible through the normal dot notation of objects. So a real quick, easy way to create stuff. Here's an example that goes out, uses jQuery, says get JSON, passing a URL. Okay. So I hope you can see this in the back. I probably should have made that a little bit bigger. You know, I could do is doesn't work. Never mind. There's a zoom, but I guess it doesn't work in this mode. So what I've done is I've got a URL that says api.flickr.com. So it's just an API that's on the Flickr site that's going to go out and fetch some images. And once I get the JSON, I've got the JSON. Now I've got this function inside of it, and the function inside is going to handle what to do with the JSON. So you can see that I think I color code this. Yeah, let's go here. You can see it better. So at the top, I've got, again, the same function that I was just showing you, the get JSON, and then the function, the data comes back. And notice there's a data.items, that's in orange. And if you look down, I've got the orange highlighted down here in the bottom. That's the JSON that came back, you know, from the Flickr API. And so under items, that's an array of objects. The first object being something that has title, link, and media. And then there's an object inside that called M. So you can see up there item.media.m, how that corresponds to that. And then data.items, you know, is all the data items that I got back. And then, so it may look a little bit terse and convoluted, but I think if you go back and look at this and look at the example, you see that it's pretty simple and straightforward. You're basically just fetching data with JSON. JSON's got a real nice, clean syntax, and it matches, of course, with JavaScript since it's part of JavaScript. and you use the dot notation and the array brackets to get down into arrays, and you can rapidly map something into something. You take the JSON then, and you could use it to generate some HTML on the page. Or you could even have the JSON return some meta information and have HTML embedded inside of it. We do that at Netflix. That's our technique for getting data back, or elements back, is we'll use JSON, because we use JSON for all of our stuff, and then we have embedded inside of some HTML, so then we do an inner HTML to replace the HTML comes back from the JSON into something. It also provides us some context, because you can add some metadata and meta information around it. You can even have two alternate HTML experiences based on something that comes back through that way. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to kind of set some context to really highlight the three challenges that I think are out there when you're trying to prototype with HTML. It's around layout, behavior, and data. I've not exhausted these at all. You can only do so much in an hour. But I hope that there's a lot of information that I've given you that gives you the context to go forward. And you'll see I've got resources. The CSS, the Missing Manual, is an awesome book. Definitely awesome book. It's just great. And then there's another book by Friends of Ed called Mastering CSS. That's a very good book too. But I really fell in love with the CSS, the Missing Manual. It really explains all the quirks of the browsers and can give you a college education in CSS pretty quickly. A lot of resources there, and more resources. Again, the presentation will be available. I will post it on my blog, looksgoodworkswell.com. Looksgoodworkswell.com. City of San Jose, I had to set up a business, and so they called it Loads Good Works Well. I closed my business. It was so annoying. Anyway, Looks Good Works Well, so it's not Loads Good Works Well. And they spelled it L-O-D-E-S. I don't know where they got that, but anyway. So more resources, and of course I want to credit all the folks on the Flickr sites that I use some images from. And by the way, I am hiring. We're hiring designers and UI engineers. So if you're interested, bscott@netflix.com is the place to connect with me. Or if you know of somebody who would like to work at Netflix. So I'll open up for questions. We have a mic here. So we've been asked if you'll go to the mic. Yeah, go ahead. Would you go to the mic? And go ahead and line up there for...
So I know there can be performance issues with jQuery if you're working with large documents or big XML. What are some pitfalls that you watch out for when you're using jQuery?
So you want to watch out for, and because let me just do this. 4 people lined up, they get free books. How about that? You should have been. Yeah. It's my book.
Great, thanks.
That. There you go. Sure. So we actually ran into this a number of times working on the queue, our queue page. And part of it is making sure your expressions are real simple. Sometimes you can't quite help it because you're trying to hit a bunch of elements on the page. So what we try to do is it's not very non-intuitive. It's just be really careful with the expressions you write and know what they're doing. So one of the dangers of jQuery and any of these expression-based syntaxes is you do really kind of have to know what's going on under the cover, because especially as the page grows, sometimes you'll set a selector up and it's picking so many elements, and the next thing you know, the page has changed. I had this happen where there was some old code, I guess, got put back into a page accidentally because some flag got tripped or whatever, and then one of the jQuery selectors was now picking up, like a bunch of stuff. It was matching on just about every thing possible. And so the page, my graphs, all of a sudden I saw this huge spike on the queue page performance-wise, and it took about a day to figure out what was going on. It wasn't really so much, it was partly the selector, but it was also the additional stuff that got put on the page. But if we've been more careful about how we wrote the selector so it's more scoped, that's one of the key things is scoping it correctly. I don't know if I answered that very well, because there's not a good way other than just throwing a lot of stuff at it and making sure that if it scales big, you're not going to go into problems. Don't assume the smallest case is, I guess what I'm saying. Yep.
All right. I want to thank you for talking about a lot of these things that just don't get very good attention in these
good.
Microsoft-sponsored conferences. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Was not a Microsoft ad. Yeah.
Real quick, it's a little off the topic, but I just wanted to get your quick sort of thoughts about Silverlight and what its future is. You know, XAML has certain advantages because it's built from scratch, and it can use 15 years of HTML know-how. And, you know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I like Silverlight a lot. We've actually, looked at, obviously for our player, it's been incredible, from that perspective. I mean, it's really helped us at Netflix get a leg up on competition. We even have the adaptive streaming. We've worked close with the Microsoft team. We've looked at, whether we should take the site to Silverlight. It's been a conversation. The problem is that the technology is so radically different in many ways, even though it uses some of the same things, obviously at the end of it all, that it's hard for us to justify the investment. Not saying that we may not consider that in the future. But I really like the tools. I'm liking what I see out of Expression Blend, especially around the rapid prototyping and those kind of things. I think they're going, at this point, a little bit disappointed in the way Adobe's gone with their tools, the Adobe Thermos, which I had hoped for. It's now got another name. I think it's a little too production-focused, too code-focused, and we need tools around the ideation. But Silverlight's a big change for us. We've got a whole Java JSP framework. We've got a lot of people that develop on Macs. And Silverlight's going to get there and starting to have some tools for the Mac, but it's really foreign, from our world. So we probably will not go to it in the lifetime of Netflix. I'm in the middle of converting the whole framework over to struts and tiles and jQuery and everything else. I'm not going to shift gears now. It's a multi-year project. So, but I do like Silverlight a lot. I think in the enterprise space, especially you have Silverlight and Flex and those kind of tools are extremely good because instead of having to deal with this wacky world of the goofy flow layout, and having 5 technologies, in our case Java, JSP, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, I have to find developers that are good in all those areas, or at least proficient in Java, and pretty decent in JSP, and then good in the other. It's pretty challenging. Finding somebody for a single technology is a lot easier, and it's a lot easier for training. So down the road, I see that things will move more and more that way. Yep.
So first of all, Bill, thanks for the talk. And
yep.
We got 2 questions. We've been playing with the YUI CSS framework for rapid prototyping, which has been interesting. We inevitably use that markup typically to go straight to production.
Yeah, I do too.
So I'm curious about your decision to go with Blueprint.
Well, we're still in the middle of making that decision. We're going to do some more vetting. We've done a little, like I said, a little prototyping with it. The main things that I'm thinking is the design team. I have the UI engineering team and the design team I work closely with. YUI CSS is a little bit more engineering focused and easier to understand by engineers than it is designers. The grid system, the YUI grid stuff is really not a completely true grid system. It's more of a nested kind of grid system. So you do a little more nesting, whereas the Blueprint in 960GS is much more of a kind of flat model that you apply the grid to. You can do the same thing with YUI Grid, and we're doing it, and I've been happy with it. It's just that I think maybe for the most flexibility, and especially getting designers to do a little bit of the prototyping, where they mock up pages and stuff, I want something they can readily understand quickly. That's what's driving it.
Okay. Last question was in regards to, you mentioned A/B testing that you were doing. We're sort of stumbling along that ourselves. What kind of numbers are you doing for examples, like with your multivariate testing, et cetera?
Yeah, so what we focus on the non-member side is all about acquisition. On the member side, it's all about retention. But you can't measure retention directly because somebody's gone, they're gone, right? So you want proxy or pre-indicators that. And in our world, it's queue ads. So people adding to the queue. If people aren't adding to the queue, then it's not a healthy experience. They're not going to have continued things coming, especially in that first day one experience. So we measure that real carefully. We always have a control cell. Every feature that goes on the site usually has 3 to 5, even sometimes 15 variations, depending on, sometimes those variations are different algorithms recommendation that tie with some UI. So you get a lot of permutations over the course of that. And then we take all those and we measure it back to the control, and we have some statisticians that determine how much allocation we need to get enough percentile confidence. And then we run that. Depends on, sometimes we'll take something, run it for a month or two if we're doing a new member kind of thing. A lot of times we test on new members because they're not already built in with a certain behavior. We'll sometimes do existing member with that, and then we'll sometimes have a back test so that we went ahead and went with this other experience, but we still want to see what happens long term, because we think that maybe, because sometimes what you'll have happen is you'll have this retention bump. We did something where we removed a lot of tabs early on in the day one experience. We saw immediate retention gain, but then as we let the test run longer, came right back to the normal line. It didn't give us any advantage at all. The same people who probably were going to leave left, and actually those people are more expensive to us because they haven't got the point where the cost per turns come down and all those sort of things that we're making money on. So we're actually keeping people around that are costing us more money, and we're also not leading people to the other parts of the site because we're reducing the tabs. So that's why the testing is so important.
I also would like to thank you because this actually has been the most practical session for what I do. I have a couple questions. I work for a pretty large shop, and we do very consumer-based sites that are on a global scale, so they're pretty conservative. We started looking at jQuery, and there's been a lot of known issues with IE6 compatibility. Which tools? Are
you running in Quarks or strict mode?
Strict.
Okay.
Which tools would you recommend for that purpose that would kind of help debug the compatibility issues for both jQuery and for CSS?
Yeah, why don't you and I, afterwards, I'd like to talk to you about that, because I don't have any direct recommendation because we haven't seen that issue with jQuery. So you may be running something we're not seeing.
Okay.
And I know John, so we can maybe get a fast track to figure out what's going on there.
And how about CSS? Because sometimes I get CSS touches that are like 3,000 lines, and like try to debug that thing. So I just put, important. But are there any like good tools that would help?
There's a tool on Firebug extension. It's called what's the name of that? It's like CSS Sweeper or something like that. And what it does is it goes through all of your CSS. You run through the pages and stuff, and it tells you stuff that it didn't see get used. That doesn't mean it's not really used. So you can sort of get a handle on how to refactor and minimize your CSS. That's your question, right? Yeah. That's the only tool I've seen like that. It's a really hard problem. There's a couple of the folks I work with at Yahoo are like our CSS gurus, and they would tinker with that on the side trying to figure out a good way to do that, and nobody's that I know of has come up with a really good way to get a handle on, because we've got a large CSS base and I've got the same problem ahead of me. I've run that tool. I think it's called CSS Sweeper. If that turns out not to be right, just email me at bscott@netflix.com, and I'll try to get it on the resources slide too. Last question. I think we'll be out of time.
Hey, just an issue I always struggle with whenever I start a new project is what JavaScript framework to use. So I know you mentioned jQuery, but I also have familiarity with the YUI JavaScript library as well as prototype. And I'm just wondering, what do you think is best suited for quick prototyping? What do you think is best suited for long-term production use?
There's what I would like to drive is not so much the prototyping as your needs on the site. And then find one that's going to do both for you. And the reason I say that is because every shop is different. In our world, we didn't need a lot of components. We have a few basic behaviors that we had on the site, and it doesn't need to be component heavy. Somebody who needs more components, YUI has a really rich set of components. And so we looked at that and went, okay, we got jQuery, doesn't have the components, we don't need them. It's real lightweight. It's a little bit lighter in the download, not much. YUI's done a real good job on that. YUI 3.0 is a lot like jQuery from the syntax. It's got the expression base, the chaining, and all that. It's kind of a moot point. But when I was making my decision, YUI 3.0 hadn't come out yet, and I knew it was going to come out because I know the team, but I didn't know exactly what direction they were going to go. And I didn't want to be in the middle of refactor and then refactor again. So jQuery made the most sense to me. Also made sense from a prototyping perspective. Anything that allows you to do expression-based is really good for prototyping. Because anytime you can get something in more of a string notation, You can automate that more. You can build GUI tools for it. I mean, there's a whole host of good ecosystem come around getting something declarative in a sense versus, being totally programmatic. EXTJS has a lot of great components, a little heavier, download size, or a good bit heavier. But it's kind of a, a religious sort of thing that people get into. Maybe that helps. Well, I thank you for your attention. If you have any comments to me, you can email me at bscott@netflix.com. I'll post the presentation up later this afternoon on looksgoodworkswell.com. It'll be on the conference site too, but you'll have the version I have there. Thank you very much.